to reverse that. When we talk about the breakdown of family, it really is the most important thing to talk about family, bringing the family back together. Frederick, I love you too. In the studying that I've done on the black family, it is interesting to consider that Frederick Douglass, former slave who played a big part in the abolitionist movement, wrote extensively about what it was like when he was a slave and what it was like for the way that slaves viewed their families. And it was such an important part of the abolitionist movement when he writes in his narrative, by the way, that he felt nothing when his mother died because families were broken down and people were constantly being traded. He felt nothing. And that's an interesting thing to consider. And it actually became an inspiration. The idea of the family being broken down became an inspiration for the abolitionist movement. And then a book came out, a book that became the most popular book of the 19th century. And it was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The irony, of course, being that today, if you are a minority conservative, the first thing you get called is an Uncle Tom. And the first thing that you should do is laugh at them because they certainly did not read the book. Uncle Tom was the hero, right? This book inspired, really, Abraham Lincoln credits it when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe. He said to her that you must be the little old woman that started this great war. Because for the first time in these pages, Americans and people abroad, the Brits as well, were able to read about the horror that slavery had unleashed upon the family. And this began that moral conversation, that Christian conversation, which is at the core of the book. Christian love is at the core of the book, and how it can redeem us from our past sins. And it woke everybody up abroad and in the North here that something is really wrong and really awful about what the institution of slavery is doing to the black family. And of course, we know a war happened and slavery ended. And so tonight, what you will see is the story of black Americans, which starts with the concept of liberation. The concept of liberation began when we were freed as slaves. It was supposed to be better. We were no longer meant to be enduring these terrible days of labor. And we know throughout the liberation period, with the Reconstruction era, a lot of attention was paid once again to the family. And one of the first rights that black Americans got was the right to get married, and they did. They instantly began marrying, and they understood, they had seen how important the family unit was to white families, and they wanted to mimic that, and they did. Despite segregation, despite the horrible period of segregation that followed, black families stayed together. But then something else happened, and then you'll see tonight we entered a different period that we are in today, which is the wilderness. If not even slavery and not even segregation could untether us from the family, what ultimately did? In the 1960s, the Great Society Act was put together, which tethered black families to the government. The government began to replace strong black fathers in the home. They would go around and they would knock on doors and they would encourage women to raise their children alone, and they could receive benefits from the government. Horrible incentivization. In the 1960s, the single motherhood rate in the black community was 23%. And in Moynihan's report, which came out, they thought this was an epidemic in the 1960s. They said 23% of black youth is growing up without a father in the home. This is an epidemic. Fast forward to today, and the single motherhood rate in the black community is 74%. You won't find that anywhere else. Nobody's talking about that or debating that. So what are we going to do? How are we going to fix it? How are we as a society, as an American society, going to realize the importance of the conservative principles that we have held on to as a nation that has brought us to the greatness that we have achieved? What are we going to do to bring us back to the roots of our conservatism? What are we going to do to bring Black America into the concept of the promised land. And that will be the last portion of the show. I will speak at the end, but we have some amazing speakers tonight, ones that have inspired my ideas when I woke up, when I was a sleepy liberal, and I turned on my internet, and I had Larry Elder and Dinesh D'Souza. Awakening me to the truth. So you guys, we have a wonderful show tonight. Enjoy it. Thank you. I'll be back out later.
You may write me down